Hey everyone, Rob here with another 5-minute book review where I try to review a book in 5 minutes. Today's episode is really special because first, it's the first fiction episode. I mostly read nonfiction, but I do occasionally read fiction. And the second, because I'm going to be reviewing more than one book, and is actually going to be 13 books of Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series. Obviously, there's no way I can actually review 13 books in about 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just focus on what I think is the most interesting and most effective and most fun about this series and why I think you should read it. Now, there's no spoilers. I'm not going to be saying anything about the plot. First, because it's stupid. There's no way I can cover the entire plot of these books in 5 minutes. And second, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who hasn't read them yet. Now, I can't obviously say anything about the comments, so be careful about reading the comments. But anyway, so for the uninitiated, this is a very famous and well-known fantasy series written by Robert Jordan. It's well-known. It's consistently on the New York Times bestsellers list. It's really famous for the length of the books, kind of how in-depth they get, both within the interpersonal relations of the characters, all the way up to the world building. But one of the great things about the series, as I'll talk about, is the world building doesn't get overwhelming enough that it detracts from the story, and there's actually interesting characters here, interesting plot developments, interesting themes. So it's good stuff. It's not the typical fantasy fare. So Robert Jordan unfortunately died a few years back. He finished off with book 11, which is Knife of Dreams, but luckily his estate has and Tor Books have had the books continue to be written, this time by Brandon Sanderson, who's taken over very well for Robert Jordan, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. So first, what I like about this series. The first thing is, so I don't really read that much fiction. I've read Lord of the Rings, but I'm not a huge fiction person, or fantasy person, mostly because I feel like a lot of fantasy is just kind of one huge MacGuffin. It seems to me, and maybe this is unfair about the genre, but I think maybe this is a fact about bad fiction in general, but I think it's just something you notice, or I notice in fantasy especially, where the stories are something on the order of, the 7 kings of Dunmore Castle have to recover the 8 gems of Benai to prevent the Skeleton King from taking over the land of Nyar. Like, the worlds just seem arbitrary. You can kind of interchange characters. And again, that's just what bad fiction is, but I feel like in the fantasy genre, you just see this in general, where the world becomes the point, instead of having the world serve the story. And this is where the Wheel of Time series does well, is that it doesn't fall into that trap. The world is the setting for a story, but the world is not the story necessarily in itself. The world is consistent, it fits together well. All the pieces seem to fit together organically. Nothing seems kind of artificial or arbitrary, which it might be in lesser fantasy. So as an example of this, gender relations, I know this topic annoys a lot of people in this series, and I'll mention a little bit about that later maybe, but I think if you just look at gender, the interactions between males and females in this world, everywhere from kind of interpersonal relations and interactions to kind of social units, family units, to political units, so how kings and queens interact, how government runs in these various kingdoms, and even up to the level of kind of cosmology and religion. You see that there is a consistency, or I don't know the exact word for it, but this theme of these gender relations are kind of manifest themselves from the bottom all the way to the top in interesting ways. So the second thing that's really good about this is it's a really long series, so you want to make sure when you read it that there's going to be a payoff, that you're not just being led astray. And that is one of the biggest strengths of this series, which is why I can so highly recommend it. Unlike some other book series or some other television shows, which will go unnamed, they kind of lead you along for years, and you think there might be a master plan. You hope there is, but as it turns out, a lot of the times, unfortunately, there is no master plan. Luckily, with this series, there clearly is. Robert Jordan clearly had spent a lot of time planning out not only the world, but also the story that he was going to tell. And it shows. I mean, even the first book, The Eye of the World, if you want to start with the series, obviously start here. Even here, you can see, and then throughout the entire series, you can see foreshadowing for what's going to happen later in the series. I mean, you have things that are kind of hinted at in book 1 that are playing out in book 12 and 13. It's really incredible. There's one character, this is not a spoiler, but it's just a small point. It's one character who, let's just say, can kind of see the future a little bit, and her predictions come true in later books, even into books 12 and 13, and then I think even into book 14 we'll see some of her predictions come true, which is just really amazing. Just shows you that he knew what he was doing when he was writing the series. So I got a wrap up quickly because I'm hitting my 5-minute limit. What I don't like, I mean, there's not much, but just as a general point, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is these books are incredibly long, and they did, especially into books 7 and 10, which are much maligned by a lot of the fans in the series, they do get a little bit long, a little bit wordy. Jordan really needed an editor who would rein him back. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. There are kind of some tropes and turns of phrase, and I know fans will know what I'm talking about here, but an example would be Braid tugging that appear again and again that could be cut. And Sanderson has done a good job to kind of cut back on that and make the story move along. Part of this is that we're in the end stages, so the story is going to move, which is a great thing because they're much easier reads, I think. Books 12 and 13 are compared to, say, 7 to 10. But of course, you sacrifice the richness of Jordan's prose and Jordan's kind of vision for the world. But I'm not complaining. There's no way he could have copied it. But it's just something to keep in mind that if you want to make the book shorter and move quicker, you're going to lose something of that kind of Jordan-esque taste, I guess, Jordan-esque prose, I guess you can say. So let's see. And by the way, Sanderson is so good that I'm going to look into his other series. Way of Kings is what he's working on after he finishes A Memory of Light, which should come out in March 2012. So the benefits, to wrap up quickly, fantasy lovers, if you haven't read it already, you must read this. It's a requirement. It's up there with Lord of the Rings and requirement in terms of you must read this if you're a fan of the genre. If you're interested in any kind of great stories and political intrigue and romance and grand adventure, magic, monsters, any of that kind of stuff, you must read it. It's just such a great series. Read book 1 if you're hooked. Once you read book 1, if you don't like it, stop, but I guarantee you'll probably be hooked. Okay. And then finally, one note, obviously, you got to have some time to invest. This is 13 books and coming on 14, thousands of pages, but it pays off in the end. I guarantee it. So look forward to more reviews, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.